millionaire spilled soup on the waitress to humiliate her. The next morning, something happened that brought him to his knees in tears of regret. The evening skyline of New York glowed in golden hues as the towering city stood in its usual relentless rhythm. At the heart of it all sat the Golden Table, an exclusive fine dining restaurant known for its exquisite cuisine and clientele of the elite. Within its opulent walls, Stephen Taylor, a man whose name alone could command attention, sipped a glass of expensive Bordeaux. He was a man who had everything: money, power, and influence. Yet his face, sharp and composed, bore a permanent expression of cold indifference. His name was synonymous with success, but also with ruthlessness. Employees whispered his name with fear. Competitors spoke it with resentment, and the world saw him as an untouchable figure in the culinary industry. Stephen checked his phone, skimming through an email about declining stock value in one of his newly acquired restaurants. His jaw clenched. Another issue? He had no time for failures. A server approached his table with an air of nervousness, her hands gripping the tray tightly. "Sir, your soup," she said, carefully placing the steaming bowl before him. Stephen barely glanced up. He reached for his spoon, but as he did, the server accidentally nudged the table's edge, causing a slight splash of soup to spill onto his sleeve. The dining room hushed. For a moment, Stephen simply stared at the stain. Then, he slowly lifted his gaze to the young woman standing before him, Emma Evans. She wasn't unfamiliar to him, one of the many faces he ignored daily, just another employee in his empire. But tonight, she had made a mistake, and in his world, mistakes were unacceptable. He picked up the bowl, his fingers tightening around the delicate porcelain. Without warning, he tilted it just enough for the remaining soup to spill directly onto Emma's apron. A collective gasp rippled through the restaurant. Emma flinched as the hot liquid soaked into the fabric. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, but she said nothing. She was used to humiliation, used to people like him. Stephen leaned back in his chair, his voice dripping with disdain. "People like you have no dignity. Your place is in the trash, right where your incompetence belongs." Silence. The words hung in the air, suffocating and sharp. A few patrons exchanged glances, but no one dared to interfere. After all, it was Stephen Taylor. Emma, her face burning with embarrassment, forced herself to breathe. She swallowed the lump in her throat and gave a small, tight nod. "I apologize, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. She grabbed a napkin and quickly wiped the table before retreating to the kitchen. Stephen watched her go, feeling no remorse. He had more important things to worry about. His time was too valuable to be wasted on the feelings of a mere waitress. At least, that's what he thought, in the kitchen. Emma exhaled shakily. The humiliation clung to her like the soup on her apron, but quitting wasn't an option. Not when she had rent to pay, not when her mother's medical bills were piling up, not when her younger brother needed her. She scrubbed at the stain furiously, as if she could wipe away the sting of his words. "Emma, you okay?" asked Sarah, a fellow waitress, her voice soft with concern. Emma forced a smile. "Yeah, just another night." But it wasn't just another night. This was a reminder, a cruel, painful reminder, that no matter how hard she worked, people like Stephen Taylor would always see her as nothing more than a speck beneath their feet. And yet, she wouldn't let this break her. Not now. Not ever. Later that night, as Stephen walked out of the Golden Table, he loosened his tie, the chill of the evening air doing little to cool his irritation. His mind was elsewhere. Business, problems, numbers. The incident with the waitress was already forgotten. Until his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. New York General Hospital. His breath hitched. "Mr. Taylor." The voice on the other end was urgent. "You need to come immediately. It's your mother." His chest tightened. Dorothy, without another thought, he hailed a car and barked the destination at the driver. As the city blurred past the window, a sinking feeling clawed at his stomach. Dorothy was the only person who had ever softened the ice in his heart, the only one who saw past the armor he wore so well. If something was wrong with her, he clenched his jaw. No, she had to be okay. Minutes later, he pushed through the hospital doors, his pulse hammering as he approached the reception desk. "Dorothy Taylor, where is she?" The nurse pointed down the hall. "Room 214, she's stable, but the doctor will explain." Stephen strode down the corridor, tension knotting his shoulders. When he reached the room, he hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping inside. And then, he froze, standing beside his mother's bed, adjusting an IV with practiced hands, was Emma Evans. His stomach twisted. Of all people in this city, why did it have to be her? Emma looked up, her expression unreadable. For the first time in his life, Stephen Taylor felt something foreign. Unease, fate, it seemed, was about to teach him a lesson. Stephen stood motionless at the doorway, his entire body stiffening at the sight before him. The sterile white walls of the hospital room seemed to close in as his gaze locked onto Emma Evans. She stood at his mother's bedside, adjusting an IV drip with the kind of practiced ease that came from experience and care. The very same woman he had humiliated just hours ago. His mind reeled of all the people in New York City, of all the nurses and medical staff in this hospital. Why did it have to be her? Emma's posture was poised, her expression unreadable as she finished her task, but Stephen noticed the flicker of something in her eyes when she finally acknowledged him. A spark of recognition, a silent understanding of the irony hanging between them. She didn't smirk, didn't gloat, but she didn't look away either. Dorothy Taylor, blissfully unaware of the tension crackling in the air, turned toward the doorway and smiled. "Oh, Stephen, you're here," she said weakly, her voice slightly hoarse but still carrying the warmth that had always been his one anchor in life. His feet moved before his mind could fully catch up, and he strode to the bed, tearing his gaze from Emma to focus on his mother. Seeing her like this, frail, connected to machines, sent an uncomfortable pang through him. "What happened?" he asked, his voice clipped and controlled, though his fingers twitched slightly at his sides. Dorothy exhaled tiredly. "It's nothing, darling. Just a little episode. I'm fine." Before Stephen could press further, a doctor entered, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Taylor," he greeted with a professional nod. "Your mother had a sudden drop in blood pressure. She lost consciousness briefly, but she responded well to treatment. She'll need to stay for observation, but for now, she's stable." Stephen absorbed the words in silence, his expression carefully schooled, though his heart pounded in his chest. He despised feeling powerless. He despised not being able to fix things. His gaze flickered back to Emma, who had stepped slightly to the side, but remained near the bed, hands folded in front of her. There was something infuriating about how unaffected she seemed. Calm, professional, not the least bit shaken by his presence. "Emma has been a great help," Dorothy added, reaching for the young woman's hand with a grateful squeeze. "She's been taking such good care of me." Stephen's stomach twisted at the genuine affection in his mother's voice. She had no idea who Emma was to him, no idea what had happened between them earlier that evening, and Emma, she wasn't milking the moment, wasn't throwing his cruelty back in his face. Instead, she returned his mother's squeeze gently, offering a small but sincere smile. "It's my job, Mrs. Taylor," she said simply. The words were humble, but something about the way she said them made Stephen's jaw tighten. This wasn't someone looking for validation. She didn't need his approval or anyone else's. Emma turned to the doctor. "I'll make sure she's comfortable and check back later." "Thank you, Emma," the doctor said before leaving the room. Stephen expected Emma to follow, but instead, she adjusted Dorothy's blankets, tucking them gently around her frail frame. Only then did she step away, moving toward the door. Stephen moved instinctively, blocking her path before he could stop himself. "What are you doing here?" Emma halted, but didn't even flinch at his tone. "I work here, Mr. Taylor." Her voice was smooth, steady, too steady. "Unlike you, I don't have the luxury of pretending people like me don't exist." Stephen felt a spark of irritation. "You're a waitress." She tilted her head slightly, eyes flicking over him as if he were the most predictable thing in the world. "I was," she corrected. "I'm also a nursing student, and this," she gestured vaguely at the hospital room, "is my actual career." For a second, Stephen just stared at her. It was one thing to see her in a restaurant, an environment where he dictated the rules. But here, she was something else entirely. She had control, and worse, his mother, the one person in the world he truly cared about, liked her. Emma exhaled through her nose, clearly done with the conversation. If you'll excuse me—" "Not yet," he cut her off, lowering his voice. "This is some kind of game for you, isn't it?" Emma's lips twitched, and for a second he thought she might actually laugh, but then her expression hardened. "You think I planned this?" she asked, stepping just a little closer. "You think I chose to be humiliated by you and then magically end up here? Sorry to disappoint you, but the universe doesn't revolve around you, Mr. Taylor. You're not nearly that important." Stephen felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Annoyance, frustration, embarrassment. Emma shook her head slightly. "But I will say this. People like you never expect to be powerless. That's why it bothers you, isn't it? That right now, your mother is in my care, and there's nothing you can do about it." The words hit something deep inside him, and he hated it. Before he could formulate a response, Emma walked past him, her confidence unwavering. The door closed softly behind her, leaving Stephen standing there, fists clenched, heart pounding. Dorothy, watching the exchange with quiet amusement, broke the silence. "She's quite something, isn't she?" Stephen exhaled slowly, turning back to face his mother. "You don't know her." Dorothy's smile was faint but knowing. "I know kindness when I see it." Stephen sat down beside her bed, his mind still tangled in knots. "You should get some rest." She chuckled weakly. "You should listen to your own advice." He didn't respond. His mother's condition was his priority. Nothing else mattered. But even as he told himself that, his mind kept drifting back to Emma. She wasn't weak, she wasn't insignificant, and that unsettled him in ways he wasn't ready to admit. The rhythmic beeping of the hospital monitors filled the silence in Dorothy Taylor's room. Stephen sat by her bedside, staring at the frail woman who had always been his one tether to humanity. The sight of her looking so small, so fragile, made something coil tightly in his chest, something he wasn't prepared to name. His mother had always been the soft balance to his sharp edges, the voice of reason when he pushed too hard, too far. And now, she lay here, barely able to keep her eyes open. He hated it. "You should rest, Mother," he murmured, watching as her eyelids grew heavier. Dorothy smiled faintly. "I will. But don't stay up all night, Stephen. You always do." His lips pressed into a thin line. He wouldn't leave until he knew she was stable. She sighed. "And don't be too hard on that girl." Stephen stiffened. "Emma." Dorothy's fingers curled weakly over his hand. "She's been kind to me." Kind. That word clung to him like a thorn. He thought back to the way Emma had looked at him earlier. Not with fear, not with awe, but with an unwavering gaze that had unsettled him. She wasn't intimidated by him, and worse, she had spoken to him like an equal. No one spoke to Stephen Taylor that way. Yet, here she was, still in his mother's room, still in his head. Dorothy's breathing evened out, her grip on his hand loosening as sleep overtook her. Stephen sat back in the chair, running a hand over his face. He needed coffee. He needed air, most of all. He needed to get Emma Evans out of his damn mind. The hospital corridors were dimly lit, the quiet hum of late-night activity the only sign of life. Stephen made his way toward the cafeteria, hoping a strong espresso would clear his head. But as he turned a corner, he nearly collided with someone. "Emma?" She took a step back, clearly not expecting to run into him either. Unlike before, she wasn't in a nurse's uniform but in casual scrubs, her hair tied into a loose ponytail. Even exhausted, she held herself with quiet composure, her eyes sharp as they met his. "Mr. Taylor," she said, her voice flat. "Emma," he returned coolly. She raised an eyebrow at his use of her name, clearly noting the difference in tone. Stephen crossed his arms. "Are you always here?" Her lips twitched. Not quite a smile. "Are you?" He exhaled sharply. "I could ask you the same thing." Emma's expression remained unreadable. "I have 2 jobs, Mr. Taylor. This one doesn't end just because you find it inconvenient." His jaw clenched. He wasn't sure what he expected from her. Maybe some sign of embarrassment, of regret for their earlier encounter. But she stood tall, unwavering. "Let's get something straight," he said, his voice dropping to a lower, more measured tone. "I don't like games. If you're looking for some kind of—" Emma cut him off. "Games." Her voice held a trace of amusement. "Let me guess. You think I have some grand plan to humiliate you in return?" Stephen's eyes narrowed. Emma exhaled, crossing her arms. You're giving yourself too much credit. I don't have time to waste on you, Mr. Taylor. That stung more than he expected. Stephen wasn't used to being dismissed. In his world, people sought his approval, his attention, his favor. Emma. She acted like he was just another person in a sea of faces, and that irritated him. A tense silence stretched between them before Emma shook her head and turned to leave. Wait. She paused but didn't turn around. Stephen hesitated. He wasn't sure why he had stopped her. Maybe it was the fact that, for the first time in years, someone wasn't trying to gain anything from him. Maybe it was because he had never been spoken to like this, like he was just another man, not Stephen Taylor, the empire builder. He cleared his throat, hating the way the words felt foreign in his mouth. Thank you for taking care of my mother. Emma turned slightly, her expression softer but still guarded. She's a good woman, she said simply. She deserves kindness. There was an unspoken unlike you in the air, but she didn't say it aloud. Instead, she gave him a final nod and walked away, leaving Stephen standing there, his thoughts more tangled than before. The next morning, Stephen arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. A fresh suit pressed and his posture as composed as ever, he expected another uneventful day of watching over Dorothy, checking emails and keeping the world in order. What he didn't expect was to overhear a conversation that stopped him cold. As he approached his mother's room, he heard Emma's voice, soft but firm. You don't have to worry about me, Mrs. Taylor, she was saying. I'll figure things out. I always do. Dorothy's voice, though weak, was filled with concern. But 2 jobs, Emma, and you still take care of your brother and mother. That's too much for one person. Stephen's brow furrowed. Emma had a brother, a sick mother. Before he could process the new information, Dorothy continued. You remind me of someone I once knew. A woman who worked herself to the bone for her family. Emma chuckled lightly. My mom used to say the same thing. Dorothy's voice softened. She must have been a wonderful woman. There was a pause. Then Emma said, She was. Something about the way she said it made Stephen's chest tighten. Dorothy sighed. You know, my husband once told me about a woman he helped long ago. A restaurant owner who was struggling but refused to give up. Emma went very still. A restaurant owner. Yes, Dorothy said wistfully. Her name was Janet. I never met her, but my husband spoke highly of her determination. Emma inhaled sharply. Janet Evans. Stephen's blood ran cold. Dorothy perked up. You knew her. Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. She was my mother. The air seemed to still. Stephen's world tilted. Janet Evans. The name sent a shockwave through him. His father had once mentioned that name in passing. A woman he had helped during a difficult time. A woman who had fought tooth and nail for her family, and Emma was her daughter. His chest tightened as the realization sank in. This wasn't just some chance encounter. This was fate pulling the strings. And for the first time in his life, Stephen Taylor didn't know what the hell to do. Stephen stood frozen outside his mother's hospital room, his mind spinning with the weight of what he had just heard. Janet Evans, the woman his father had spoken of in quiet admiration. The woman he had once helped in a moment of desperation. Emma's mother. The revelation settled over him like an anchor, heavy and unrelenting. He had assumed Emma was just another struggling worker, another person trying to make ends meet in a city that devoured the weak. But now, he saw the undeniable thread that connected their lives in a way he never could have anticipated. Before he could step inside, Emma walked out of the room, her eyes downcast as if lost in thought. When she finally looked up and saw him standing there, her expression hardened. Eavesdropping now, Mr. Taylor, she said, crossing her arms. Stephen wasn't in the mood for his usual sharp retorts. His mind was still piecing things together, still trying to understand the implications of what he had just learned. Your mother, he said slowly, watching her carefully. She owned a restaurant. Emma's jaw tightened. Not that it's any of your business, but yes, a small place. She worked herself to exhaustion trying to keep it afloat. Stephen exhaled, the pieces clicking into place. His father had mentioned buying out a small restaurant years ago, a deal that had been framed as a lifeline, a way to help a struggling business. But something told him that wasn't the full story. Emma, however, wasn't interested in his inner revelations. She brushed past him, her posture stiff. Emma, wait. She stopped but didn't turn. Stephen hesitated. He wasn't sure what he was trying to say, only that he needed to say something. "I didn't know," he admitted. "About your mother." Emma let out a humorless chuckle. "Why would you? People like you don't look down far enough to see the rest of us." Stephen's stomach twisted at the truth in her words. Emma shook her head. "Save whatever guilt you're feeling, Mr. Taylor. It doesn't change anything." With that, she walked away, leaving Stephen standing there, confronted by a reality he had spent his whole life ignoring. Later that evening, Stephen found himself sitting in his office, staring at the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows. His glass of whiskey sat untouched on the desk. He had spent hours digging through old records, looking for anything related to the restaurant his father had bought years ago, and he had found it, buried in contracts and financial statements. Janet Evans had owned the Golden Table, the very restaurant where he had humiliated her daughter. Stephen leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. He prided himself on being in control, on knowing every detail of his empire. Yet here he was, blindsided by the past. His father had always framed the deal as an act of kindness, a way to help a struggling businesswoman stay afloat. But reading between the lines, Stephen saw the truth. Janet hadn't willingly sold her restaurant. She had been forced to. The deal had been anything but fair. A pit formed in his stomach. His family hadn't saved Janet Evans. They had taken something from her, and Emma had suffered the consequences. The next morning, as the sun cast golden hues over the city, Emma stood at the counter of a modest coffee shop, waiting for her order. Her shift at the hospital had been grueling. A double shift, no sleep, and a throbbing headache to top it all off. But she still had another job to get to. Balancing 2 jobs and nursing school wasn't just difficult. It was brutal. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from her brother, Lucas. "Lucas," Mom's doctor called. "We need another payment by the end of the month." Emma closed her eyes, exhaustion weighing heavy on her bones. The medical bills never stopped coming, no matter how hard she worked. She was always playing catch-up. Grabbing her coffee, she stepped outside into the crisp morning air and nearly ran straight into Stephen Taylor. She stopped short, blinking up at him. "You have a habit of appearing at the worst possible times," she muttered, taking a sip of her coffee. Stephen studied her, his usual cold expression tinged with something unfamiliar, guilt. "I need to talk to you," he said. Emma sighed. "Whatever it is, I don't have time." Stephen ignored her and gestured to a nearby bench. 5 minutes. Emma considered arguing, but ultimately let out a tired sigh and sat down. "Fine. What is it?" Stephen exhaled slowly. "I looked into it. Your mother's restaurant, the Golden Table." Emma's grip on her coffee cup tightened. "She didn't sell it willingly," Stephen continued. "The deal wasn't fair." Emma let out a bitter laugh. "And you're just figuring that out now?" Stephen didn't flinch. "I didn't know, but now I do." Emma stared at him, waiting for the punchline. When none came, she shook her head. "What do you want?" "You, Stephen, an apology," she scoffed. "You think admitting it now makes a difference?" Stephen remained silent for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "No," he said finally. "I think it means I have a responsibility to fix it." Emma narrowed her eyes. "Fix it? I'm not my father," he said, "and I won't pretend the past didn't happen. But I can make things right." Emma let out a slow, disbelieving breath. "You think you can just throw money at this? That's what you do, right? Solve problems with a check." Stephen's jaw tightened. "I'm offering you something real." Emma shook her head. "I don't need your charity." "This isn't charity," he said firmly. "It's reparations." Emma blinked, thrown by his choice of words. "I want to return the Golden Table to you," Stephen said. "It should have been yours." Emma's heart pounded. Of all the things she had expected him to say, this wasn't even on the list. For the first time, Stephen Taylor looked at her not with arrogance, not with indifference, but with something almost resembling sincerity. Emma opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Stephen Taylor was offering her back the life her mother had lost, and she had no idea what to do with that. Emma stared at Stephen, her grip tightening around the coffee cup in her hands. His words echoed in her head, repeating like a broken record. "I want to return the Golden Table to you." She had spent years pushing herself beyond exhaustion, taking on every possible shift, juggling school and work just to keep her family afloat. And now, Stephen Taylor, the same man who had humiliated her, who had always looked at people like her as if they were beneath him, was sitting across from her, offering her back the restaurant that had been stolen from her mother. She should have been angry. She should have laughed in his face. But instead, all she felt was disbelief. Emma let out a slow breath, forcing herself to remain composed. Why? Stephen's gaze was steady. Because it's the right thing to do. Emma scoffed, shaking her head. You don't do things because they're right, Mr. Taylor. You do them because they benefit you. His jaw clenched slightly. You're not wrong. But this time it's different. Emma narrowed her eyes. And why is that? Stephen hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. Because my father took something from your mother, and I don't want to keep repeating his mistakes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The early morning rush of New York City moved around them, people bustling past, car horns blaring in the distance. But in this moment, it was just them. Emma exhaled sharply, leaning back against the bench. You think you can just fix everything by handing me a restaurant? I think it's a start, Stephen said evenly. Emma shook her head. It's not that simple. I know it's not. She looked at him then. Really looked at him. He wasn't sneering at her. He wasn't throwing around his usual arrogance. There was something different in his eyes. Something she wasn't sure she trusted. This doesn't change anything, she muttered, more to herself than to him. Stephen sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. Look, I know you don't trust me. Frankly, I don't blame you. But this isn't about me. It's about making things right. Emma's fingers drummed against her cup. I need time to think. Stephen nodded once. Take all the time you need. Emma didn't say anything else. Instead, she stood, tossing her coffee cup into a nearby trash bin before walking away, leaving Stephen alone on the bench. Later that evening, Emma found herself standing outside her apartment, staring at the chipped paint on the doorframe. Her thoughts tangled in knots. Lucas was inside, probably playing video games, pretending that everything was fine even when it wasn't. Their mother was resting, her treatments taking more out of her each day. And Emma, she was exhausted. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, greeted by the familiar scent of home-cooked food. Lucas glanced up from the couch, controller in hand. Hey, Em, long day. She forced a small smile. Something like that. Lucas's eyes flickered with curiosity. You look like you saw a ghost. Emma let out a tired laugh, dropping her bag onto the small dining table. Not a ghost, just unexpected news. Lucas raised an eyebrow. Good or bad? Emma hesitated. I don't know yet. He didn't push, but she could see the unspoken questions in his eyes. Their mother emerged from the small hallway, her frail frame wrapped in a thick cardigan. Emma, sweetheart, you're home late. Emma walked over, pressing a gentle kiss to her mother's forehead. I stayed at the hospital a little longer. Her mother studied her with quiet concern. Everything all right? Emma opened her mouth to lie, to brush off the weight pressing on her chest. But something in her mother's eyes stopped her. She took a deep breath. Mom, do you remember Stephen Taylor? A flicker of something passed through her mother's expression. Recognition. Yes, she said slowly. Dorothy's son. Why? Emma swallowed. He found out about the restaurant, about what happened. Her mother's face fell slightly. Oh, Emma hesitated. He wants to give it back. Silence stretched between them. Her mother's brows furrowed. Give it back. Emma nodded. Just like that. Her mother let out a soft, humorless laugh. Nothing in this world happens just like that, sweetheart. Emma exhaled. I know. Her mother sighed, sinking into one of the dining chairs. It was a long time ago, Emma. I made peace with it. Emma's chest tightened. But you shouldn't have had to. Her mother reached for her hand, squeezing gently. What matters is what you want, not what I lost. Emma bit her lip, unsure of what to say. Lucas, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. So what are you gonna do? Emma didn't have an answer. The next morning, Stephen sat in his office, scrolling through documents. But his mind was elsewhere. He had done what he could. Now, it was up to Emma. His phone buzzed on the desk. Emma, I want to talk. The restaurant. Meet me at the golden table. A slow smirk curled at the corner of his lips, this was far from over. The golden glow of the late afternoon sun bathed the golden table in warm light, casting long shadows across the empty dining area. The restaurant had not yet opened for dinner service. But Emma stood near the entrance, arms crossed, waiting. She wasn't sure why she had chosen this place for their conversation. Maybe because it was the center of everything. The past, the injustice, the opportunity Stephen was now offering her. Standing here, she could almost hear her mother's laughter in the kitchen. Smell the comforting scent of fresh bread and simmering sauces. This place should have been hers now. Stephen Taylor wanted to hand it back to her. The sound of the front door opening pulled her from her thoughts. She turned as Stephen stepped inside, his suit impeccable as always, his expression unreadable. "Punctual," she murmured. Stephen arched an eyebrow. "You sound surprised." Emma shook her head, exhaling. Not surprised, just skeptical. He took a slow glance around the restaurant, his gaze sharp, assessing. There was no arrogance in his expression this time, just something contemplative, something distant. "I looked into the history of this place," he said. "The way my father took it from your mother." Emma tensed. Took it is a generous way to put it. He didn't put a gun to her head, but he might as well have. Stephen didn't argue. "I won't pretend to understand what she went through," he admitted. "But I know what my family did, and I know what it cost you." Emma studied him carefully. "And now you think you can fix it. I think I can try." His words were simple, direct, but something about the sincerity in his voice unsettled her. Emma gestured toward one of the booths. "Sit." Stephen hesitated for only a second, before lowering himself onto the cushioned seat. Emma slid into the opposite side, folding her hands on the table. "Let's be clear about something," she said. "I don't trust you." Stephen nodded slightly, as if he had expected that. "Fair. I don't believe this is purely about doing the right thing," she continued. "You're Stephen Taylor. You don't just give things away." His lips curled in the barest hint of a smirk. "True." Emma narrowed her eyes. "So, what's your angle?" Stephen leaned back slightly, watching her with a measured expression. "What happened to your mother was wrong, and I can't change that. But I can make sure this place goes back to where it belongs." Emma arched an eyebrow. And, he continued, "I think you're smart enough to know running a restaurant is more than just a dream. It takes money, connections, management." Emma's stomach tightened. She did know. Stephen folded his hands on the table. "I'm offering you the golden table, but I'm also offering something else, a partnership." Emma's breath hitched. "A what?" "I'll return the restaurant to you, but I want a stake in it," Stephen said plainly. "Not as your boss, not as your owner, as your partner." Emma let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "So, let me get this straight. You want to give me the restaurant that should have been mine in the first place? And in return, you still get to keep a share of it?" Stephen didn't flinch. "Yes." Her temper flared. "You really don't know when to stop, do you?" He sighed, rubbing his temple. "Emma, I'm not trying to take advantage of you. I'm offering you the resources you'll need to actually make this place successful again." She clenched her jaw. "And let me guess, that comes with you calling the shots." "No," Stephen said evenly. "It means we work together. You have the vision, the heart for this place. I have the financial backing and the experience to keep it running." Emma hated that a small part of her knew he was right. She could cook. She could manage people. She could lead. But the business side, the cutthroat negotiations, the marketing, the logistics, those were gaps she wasn't sure she could fill on her own. Stephen studied her hesitation. "I know what you're thinking, that this is just another way for me to keep control, but this isn't about me. Emma, it's about making sure you don't drown trying to rebuild something from scratch." Emma exhaled slowly. "And what do you get out of this?" Stephen leaned forward slightly. "A chance to prove that I'm not my father." She went still. He wasn't looking at her with that smug arrogance anymore. He wasn't throwing money in her face. Expecting her to grovel, he was offering her something else, something dangerous, a choice. Emma's fingers curled against the edge of the table. "I don't need your money." "No," Stephen agreed, "but you need the support, and whether you want to admit it or not, I can give you that." She hated how much sense he made. Her entire life had been about fighting alone, carrying everything on her shoulders. And now, for the first time, Someone was offering to share the weight, even if that someone was Stephen Taylor. Emma inhaled deeply. "I'll think about it." Stephen nodded, as if he knew that was the best answer he would get tonight. "No rush," he said, standing. "Just don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't come twice." Emma rolled her eyes. "And there's the Stephen Taylor I know." He smirked, but there was something different in his eyes, something almost unreadable. "I'll see you soon, Emma." With that, he walked out, leaving her alone in the restaurant that was meant to be hers. And for the first time in years, she didn't know what her next move should be. For the next few days, Emma carried an unfamiliar weight on her shoulders. Stephen Taylor's offer hung over her like a storm cloud, refusing to be ignored no matter how much she tried to push it aside. She went about her routine, long shifts at the hospital, checking in on her mother, making sure Lucas had everything he needed. But in the back of her mind, the golden table called to her. Her mother had built that restaurant with love, pouring every ounce of herself into it. It wasn't just a business. It was history, family, a symbol of everything her mother had worked for, and for years it had been stolen from them. Now, Stephen was handing it back, but at what cost? Emma knew better than to trust a man like him. He wasn't offering her the restaurant out of the kindness of his heart. People like Stephen Taylor didn't believe in generosity without strings attached. He was a businessman, cutthroat, calculating, and yet, there had been something different in his voice when he made the offer. A sliver of sincerity. Emma didn't know if she was foolish for considering it, or if she'd be a fool to turn it down. That thought gnawed at her as she finished another grueling shift at the hospital. She barely remembered the walk home, the cold air biting at her skin as she navigated the city streets. Her legs ached, her head throbbed, but exhaustion was the least of her problems. She needed answers, and there was only one place she could get them before she could talk herself out of it. Emma changed directions. Heading toward the golden table, the restaurant was dark when she arrived, closed for the night. But when she peered through the large windows, she saw a single light still on, and Stephen Taylor standing inside. Of course he was here. With a steadying breath, she pushed open the door. The chime echoed through the empty space as Stephen turned, arching an eyebrow at her sudden arrival. "I was starting to think you weren't coming back," he said, setting down a stack of papers. Emma folded her arms. "I didn't say yes, but you didn't say no," she exhaled, stepping further inside. The air was thick with the scent of aged wood and something faintly familiar, like the remnants of spices still clinging to the walls from years of cooking. This place still held ghosts. "I need more than promises, Stephen," she said, her voice firm. "If I do this, if I agree to your so-called partnership, I need to know I won't regret it." Stephen leaned against the bar, watching her carefully. "What do you need?" She hesitated before answering. "Control." His brow arched slightly. "Control," Emma nodded. "I don't want to be some token owner while you pull all the strings. If I agree to this, I need to be the one making the calls. I need to know that the golden table is being rebuilt in a way that honors what it was, not just another piece in your empire." Stephen considered her words carefully. "That's fair." Emma blinked. "Just like that." He smirked slightly. "You think I don't know how much this place means to you? How much your mother meant to it? I wouldn't be offering you this if I didn't think you were the right person to run it." His words surprised her more than she wanted to admit. Emma exhaled. "And what do you get out of this?" Stephen's expression was unreadable for a moment, before he finally spoke. "I get to fix something my family broke." For the first time, Emma saw something in him that wasn't just arrogance or self-interest. There was a quiet weight behind his words, a hint of something that almost resembled remorse. It was unsettling, and yet, she found herself considering the offer more seriously than she had before. "I want everything in writing," she said firmly. "A contract that guarantees I have final say in how things are run." Stephen nodded. "Done." Emma studied him, searching for deception. "And I don't want to wake up one morning and find out you've changed your mind. If we do this, it's permanent," he smirked. "Emma, once I make a decision, I don't change my mind." She exhaled slowly, her pulse thrumming in her ears. This was it, the decision that could change everything. After a long pause, she extended her hand. "Fine, we do this. But if you try to screw me over, Taylor, I'll burn this place down before I let you take it from me again." Stephen chuckled. but there was something almost genuine in his amusement. He reached out, taking her hand in a firm grip. Deal. The second their hands clasped, Emma felt a shift in the air. She didn't know what kind of storm she had just walked into, but one thing was clear. Her life would never be the same again. Emma had made plenty of difficult decisions in her life, but none had ever felt quite like this. Agreeing to work with Stephen Taylor wasn't just about reclaiming her mother's legacy. It was about stepping into dangerous territory. He was the kind of man who played by his own rules, who manipulated situations to his advantage, and now she had willingly walked into his world. What the hell was she thinking? The morning after shaking hands with him, reality hit her hard. She sat at the kitchen table in their small apartment, staring at the cup of coffee in front of her, barely hearing the sound of Lucas shuffling around behind her. "You look like you haven't slept," he said, grabbing a bowl of cereal and flopping onto the chair across from her. Emma let out a dry chuckle. "Probably because I haven't." Lucas took a bite and studied her carefully. "This is about him, isn't it?" She didn't need to ask who him was. She sighed, rubbing her temples. "I made a deal with Stephen." Lucas nearly choked on his cereal. "You what?" "I didn't have much of a choice," she muttered. "He offered me a partnership. I get to run the golden table, the way I want, but he still has a stake in it." Lucas set his spoon down slowly. "And you trust him?" Emma scoffed. "Of course not. Then why the hell did you agree?" "Because it was the only way." She didn't say that out loud. Instead, she exhaled. "Because I know what I'm doing. I made sure I have control. He knows that." Lucas leaned back, arms crossed. "I don't know, Em. This guy treated you like trash and now you're partners." He shook his head. "Something about this doesn't sit right." Emma tapped her fingers against her coffee mug. "Believe me, I don't like it either, but it's the only way to get back what was stolen from us." Lucas frowned but didn't argue. He just watched her for a long moment before sighing. "Just be careful, okay?" Emma forced a smile. "Always." Later that afternoon, Emma found herself walking into Stephen's sleek corporate office in Midtown Manhattan. The contrast between this place and the golden table was almost laughable. Everything here was pristine, modern, cold, just like him. She was barely seated when Stephen strode in, looking completely unfazed by the life-changing decision they had made the night before. "I assume you've had time to think things over," he said, taking a seat across from her. Emma crossed her arms. "I don't need to think. I need to see the contract." Stephen smirked, clearly amused. "Straight to business." "I respect that." He slid a stack of neatly printed documents across the table. "Everything we discussed is in here. You get majority control over operations. I retain a financial stake, but I don't interfere in day-to-day decisions unless there's a major financial risk." Emma scanned the pages carefully, her heart pounding as she read through the details. To her surprise, it was exactly as they had discussed. No hidden clauses, no fine print designed to screw her over. She glanced up at him. "You actually kept your word." Stephen leaned back in his chair. "I told you, Emma. This isn't about screwing you over. This is about fixing what never should have happened." She studied him for a moment, searching for deception. She wasn't used to men like him playing fair. "Fine," she finally said, picking up the pen. "Let's do this." She signed her name on the dotted line, sealing the deal that would change everything. As she set the pen down, Stephen extended a hand. Emma hesitated for only a second before shaking it. The moment their hands met, she felt it again. That shift in the air, the unspoken tension that neither of them acknowledged. She was stepping into the lion's den, and for better or worse, there was no turning back. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, paperwork, and planning. Emma barely had time to breathe as she worked on the logistics of reopening the golden table, hiring staff, redesigning the menu, making sure the suppliers were in place. It was overwhelming but exhilarating. She had spent her entire life fighting for control, and now, for the first time, she had it. But there was one thing she wasn't prepared for: Stephen Taylor's presence. He was always there, not in an overbearing way, but in the way that made it clear he was keeping an eye on everything. He didn't micromanage, didn't interfere, but his presence was impossible to ignore. And worse, he was actually helpful. When an issue came up with the building permits, He had it handled before she even had time to panic. When one of the suppliers tried to overcharge them, Stephen made one call and got it sorted. He was efficient, strategic, and infuriatingly competent. Emma hated that she was starting to respect him. One evening, after another long day, she found herself sitting at the bar of the restaurant, reviewing notes on a worn-out legal pad. "You're overworking yourself." Stephen's voice broke through her focus. She looked up to find him leaning against the counter, watching her with that annoyingly unreadable expression. Emma let out a tired chuckle. "I don't have the luxury of taking it easy." Stephen tilted his head slightly. "You do now." She narrowed her eyes. "What's that supposed to mean?" He shrugged. "You don't have to do everything alone anymore, Emma. You have a team now. You have me." Emma's stomach twisted at the casual way he said it. She wasn't sure what unsettled her more, the fact that he said it, or the fact that a small part of her believed him. She exhaled, shaking her head. "I don't trust you, Taylor." Stephen smirked. "You don't have to." And for the first time, Emma wasn't sure if she was still trying to convince him of that, or herself. The days leading up to the Golden Table's reopening felt like a whirlwind. Emma barely had time to think, let alone breathe. The kitchen was being restocked, final renovations were underway, and the new staff had begun their training. It was exhausting, exhilarating, and utterly terrifying all at once. She had never run a restaurant before, not fully. She had watched her mother do it, had worked in kitchens and waited tables for years. But this, being the one responsible for everything, felt different, heavier. And then there was Stephen. He was everywhere, not in an intrusive way, but in a way that made it impossible for her to forget that she wasn't alone in this. Whenever a problem arose, he was already working on a solution. When a last-minute licensing issue threatened to delay the opening, Stephen made a call and fixed it within the hour. Emma hated how competent he was. She hated even more that she was starting to appreciate his presence. Late one evening, after another long day of preparations, she found herself at the restaurant alone, standing behind the bar, staring at the empty space. The silence was almost unnerving. This place had once been alive with laughter, the clinking of glasses, the steady hum of conversation. It had meant something. And tomorrow, it would again. "You're still here." Emma jumped slightly, turning to find Stephen standing near the entrance. He wasn't in his usual pristine suit, just a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his expression unreadable. "I could say the same about you," she said, crossing her arms. Stephen walked over, leaning against the bar. "I had a meeting nearby, thought I'd check in." Emma arched a brow. "You don't strike me as the checking in type." He smirked. "I'm full of surprises." She rolled her eyes but couldn't stop the small smile that tugged at her lips. Stephen glanced around the restaurant. "How are you feeling about tomorrow?" Emma exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "Excited, nervous, slightly nauseous." "That's a good sign," he said simply. She gave him a look. "You like feeling nauseous. I like knowing I'm doing something that matters." The words were casual, but there was something about the way he said them that made Emma pause. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, she sighed. "I keep thinking about my mom," she admitted, "about what she'd say if she could see this place now." Stephen was quiet for a beat before saying, "What do you think she'd say?" Emma hesitated. "She'd be proud, but she'd also tell me to stop overthinking and just do it." She let out a small laugh. "She always said the best dishes came from instinct, not hesitation." Stephen studied her carefully. "She sounds like she was an incredible woman." She was. A comfortable silence stretched between them. Then Stephen spoke again, his voice softer than usual. "You know, I don't think my father ever meant to hurt your mother." Emma stiffened. "That's easy for you to say." He didn't argue. Instead, he exhaled slowly. "I looked through the records. The restaurant wasn't failing when he bought it. It was struggling, but it could have recovered." He met her gaze. "I think he thought he was helping, but in the end it wasn't his choice to make." Emma swallowed, feeling a familiar sting of anger. It wasn't just about the money, Stephen. It was about her, about the fact that this place was hers, and she lost it because someone with more power decided they knew better. Stephen didn't flinch at the bitterness in her voice. "I know." Emma studied him carefully. "Him. And what about you? What about me?" "You're Stephen Taylor," she said. You built an empire off of taking things, buying out smaller businesses, expanding your reach. How do I know you're not just like him?" Stephen held her gaze for a long moment before answering. "Because I don't want to be." The words were simple, but something about the way he said them made Emma believe him. She let out a slow breath. "Tomorrow is the first day of the rest of the Golden Table's life," she said. "Let's hope we don't screw it up." Stephen smirked. "Speak for yourself. I don't do failure." Emma shook her head with a small chuckle. "Of course you don't." She turned back toward the bar, but before she could say anything else, Stephen's voice cut through the air again. "For what it's worth, I'm proud of you." Emma froze. Slowly, she turned to face him, but Stephen had already pushed off the bar, straightening his sleeves like nothing had happened. Her chest tightened. She wasn't sure what unsettled her more, the fact that he had said it, or the fact that she had needed to hear it. The morning of the Golden Table's reopening felt like an electric current, humming beneath Emma's skin. She had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with lists, schedules, and last-minute concerns. The weight of responsibility pressed against her chest. This wasn't just another restaurant opening. It was her mother's legacy, her family's redemption, and a chance to prove that she could do this. By the time she arrived at the restaurant, the staff was already buzzing with activity. The scent of fresh bread, sizzling butter, and rich spices filled the air as the kitchen came to life. Servers adjusted table settings, polished glassware, and rehearsed their routines. There was a tension in the air, the kind that always preceded something monumental. Emma stood near the bar, clipboard in hand, taking it all in. This was really happening. "Emma." She turned to see Sarah, one of her new hires, looking slightly panicked. "The vendor just dropped off the seafood order, but it's missing half the shrimp and the wine distributor is late." Emma's pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Okay, we'll adjust the menu if we have to. I'll call the distributor and find out what's going on." Deep breaths. "Sarah, we've got this." Sarah nodded, visibly relieved, before hurrying back toward the kitchen. Emma exhaled, rubbing her temple. This was what opening a restaurant looked like. Chaos, pressure, and a million things going wrong all at once. She barely had a moment to catch her breath before another voice cut through the noise. "You look like you're about to pass out." Emma turned, unsurprised to find Stephen standing nearby, arms crossed, watching her with that infuriatingly observant expression. She sighed. "Not now, Taylor." Stephen smirked. "You need to pace yourself. You won't survive the night if you burn out before we even open the doors." Emma shot him a look. "You're so good at being supportive. I'm practical." He studied her for a moment before reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a small wrapped candy. "Take this." Emma blinked. "Is that a peppermint?" He shrugged. "You skipped breakfast, didn't you?" Emma hesitated before snatching the candy from his hand. "This doesn't mean I like you." Stephen smirked. "You keep saying that, and yet, here we are." Before Emma could fire back a response, one of the chefs called her name, and she was pulled back into the chaos. As the evening approached, the restaurant filled with the low hum of anticipation. The first guests began arriving: food critics, industry insiders, longtime patrons who had been waiting for the Golden Table to return. Emma moved through the space, checking in with staff, making sure everything was running smoothly. And then, as she turned toward the entrance, she saw her mother. Her breath caught. Dorothy Taylor stood beside Lucas, her frame thinner than Emma would have liked, but her eyes were bright with pride. She wore a soft blue dress, her hands clasped together as she took in the restaurant. Emma hurried over, hugging her mother tightly. "You made it," she murmured. Dorothy smiled. "Of course I did. I wouldn't miss this for the world." Lucas grinned. "You look like you're about to cry." Emma sniffed. "Shut up." Dorothy took Emma's hands in hers. "Your mother would be so proud of you." "Sweetheart." Emma swallowed hard, nodding. "I hope so." Before the moment could get too emotional, a familiar voice interrupted. "Mrs. Taylor." Emma turned to find Stephen standing beside them, his usual confidence tempered with something softer. Dorothy tilted her head. "Stephen, it's been a long time." Stephen nodded. "It has. I just wanted to say, I'm glad you're here." Dorothy smiled knowingly. "So am I." Emma glanced between them. unsure what to make of the exchange. There was something almost respectful in Stephen's demeanor, something different from the usual arrogance he carried. She didn't have time to dwell on it. The night was in full swing. As the evening progressed, the kitchen worked seamlessly, dishes flying out with precision. The guests murmured their approval, the energy in the room growing with each passing moment. Emma moved through it all like she belonged here, because she did. At some point, she found herself standing beside Stephen, watching the dining room. "It's working," she murmured. Stephen nodded. "Of course it is." Emma glanced at him. "You really weren't worried?" He smirked. "Emma, I don't make investments that fail." She rolled her eyes but couldn't stop the small smile that tugged at her lips. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel it. Hope. The past wasn't erased. The wounds weren't fully healed. But maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. The reopening of the golden table had been an undeniable triumph. The last guests had left. The tables were cleared, and the once bustling dining room now sat in a quiet lull. The only sounds that remained were the faint clinking of glasses as the staff finished up, and the distant hum of the city beyond the large windows. Emma should have been exhausted. In truth, she was. Every muscle in her body ached. Her feet throbbed, and the adrenaline that had carried her through the night was finally fading. But even through the exhaustion, there was something else. A feeling she hadn't allowed herself to embrace in a long time. Pride. She leaned against the bar, running a hand through her hair, letting the moment sink in. She had done it. The restaurant was hers again. It wasn't just another job, another long shift she had to push through to make ends meet. It was a homecoming, a restoration of what had once been lost. And yet, she wasn't alone in this. Her gaze drifted toward the far side of the room, where Stephen stood near the entrance. Talking with one of his business associates, he looked as composed as ever, not a single hair out of place, despite the fact that the night had been long and unpredictable. As if sensing her stare, he glanced in her direction, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, neither of them moved. Neither of them. It was a strange thing, standing on opposite sides of the room, connected by something neither of them could quite define. He had been right. The golden table had worked, but Emma wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of admitting that outright. She pushed off the bar, making her way toward him. "I guess this is the part where you gloat." Stephen turned slightly, his lips curving into a smirk. "I would never." Emma arched a brow. "That's a lie." He chuckled, the sound deep and amused. "Fine, I could gloat, but I'll spare you for tonight." Emma rolled her eyes, but there was no real heat behind it. She hated to admit it, but in some twisted way, she had grown used to his arrogance. Maybe even, God help her, found it amusing at times. A few of the remaining staff members passed by, offering tired but satisfied smiles. "Great job tonight, boss," one of them said, before heading out. The word boss settled into Emma's chest like a tangible weight. This was real. This was hers. Stephen must have caught the look on her face because his voice softened slightly. "It suits you, you know." She glanced at him. "What does being in charge?" Emma exhaled, folding her arms. "I've spent my whole life being told what to do. It's different. Having people look at me like I actually belong here." Stephen studied her for a moment, something unreadable passing through his expression. "You do belong here?" The words were simple, but there was something about the way he said them that made Emma's breath hitch for just a second. She quickly shook it off. "Well, if you keep complimenting me, I might start thinking you actually like working with me." Stephen smirked. "Let's not get carried away." Emma chuckled, shaking her head. Just then, Sarah, one of the waitresses, approached, looking slightly nervous. "Emma, sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to say thank you for bringing this place back." Emma blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Oh, you don't have to thank me." "Sarah." "I do," Sarah insisted. "This place, it's more than just a restaurant to a lot of us. It's home, and I just wanted you to know that." Emma felt her throat tighten. She wasn't sure how to respond. She had spent so long fighting just to survive, to make it through each day, that she had never really stopped to think about what the golden table meant to others. She swallowed, nodding. "That means a lot." Sarah smiled before heading out, leaving Emma standing there. suddenly feeling like she was carrying something even heavier than before. Stephen, to his credit, didn't say anything right away. He let her process. And then, after a long moment, he said quietly, "Your mother would be proud of you." Emma inhaled sharply, turning to face him. The sincerity in his voice caught her off guard. There was no teasing, no arrogance, just honesty. She swallowed hard. "You don't know that." Stephen held her gaze. "I do." Something inside Emma shifted. She had spent so much time resenting him, so much energy convincing herself that he was the enemy. But now, she wasn't so sure. There was something different in him, or maybe there had always been, and she was only now allowing herself to see it. "I should finish up," she murmured, glancing toward the bar. Stephen nodded, stepping back slightly. Of course, she expected him to leave. Instead, he hesitated. "Emma?" She turned. He looked at her for a moment, as if debating something. Then, in a low voice, he said, "You did good tonight." Emma's lips parted slightly, but before she could respond, he was already walking toward the exit. She watched as he disappeared through the doors, leaving her standing in the middle of the restaurant, her heart pounding for reasons she didn't want to analyze. She had won tonight, so why did it feel like the real battle was only just beginning? The morning after the Golden Table's grand reopening, Emma woke up with an unfamiliar feeling, one she hadn't allowed herself to embrace in years. Relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, she hadn't spent the night worrying about how to make ends meet, or whether her family would be okay. The restaurant had reopened successfully. The customers had left satisfied, and for once, she could take a breath without feeling like the weight of the world was pressing down on her chest. But the feeling didn't last long. Reality had a way of creeping in. She rubbed her eyes and sat up, stretching her sore muscles. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, and she grabbed it, already knowing who it was before she even looked at the screen. Stephen Taylor. Emma groaned. He really didn't believe in giving people a moment of rest. Did he? She swiped to open the message. "Stephen, there's a meeting at noon. Don't be late." No greeting, no acknowledgement of the fact that she had barely slept, just straight to business. Typical. Emma rolled her eyes, but she couldn't deny that a part of her had expected it. There was no time to bask in last night's success. This was just the beginning. By the time Emma arrived at Stephen's office, she had downed 2 cups of coffee and still felt like she needed 5 more. The sleek, modern conference room was already occupied when she walked in. Stephen, of course, along with a few other executives who looked like they had been born wearing tailored suits and expensive watches. Stephen glanced up when she entered, his expression unreadable. "Glad you could join us, Evans." Emma forced a smile. "Well, I figured if I ignored you, you'd just show up at my apartment." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. Tempting. She rolled her eyes and took a seat. The meeting started immediately, diving into financial reports, customer feedback, and next steps for the restaurant. Most of it was standard business talk, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Stephen was different, not in a dramatic way, but in subtle shifts. He was still sharp, still precise, but there was something in his demeanor that felt less guarded, less cold, or maybe she was just imagining it. Emma pushed the thought aside and focused on the conversation at hand. "So," Stephen said, leaning forward slightly, "first night numbers were strong, better than expected." Emma nodded. "We had a full house, and most of the reservations for the next 2 weeks are already booked." One of the executives, a man named Harris, frowned slightly. And yet, some of the critics were, let's say, hesitant. Emma's stomach clenched. Hesitant how? Harris slid a tablet across the table. A few reviews mentioned concerns about the authenticity of the restaurant's revival. Some think it's just another acquisition for Taylor Enterprises. Emma's jaw tightened. "That's not what this is." Stephen sighed, rubbing his temple. "I know that, and you know that, but to the outside world it looks like I swooped in and took over." Emma exhaled sharply. "So what do we do?" Harris exchanged a glance with another executive before saying, "A media push, interviews, PR engagements. You, specifically, need to be the face of this." Emma blinked. "Me?" Stephen nodded. "You're the heart of the Golden Table, Emma. You need to tell the story. People need to know this wasn't just another business move." Emma hesitated. She wasn't used to the spotlight. She had spent her whole life fighting just to stay afloat. Not selling a story to the press, but she also knew they were right. If she wanted the golden table to truly thrive, people had to believe in it. She exhaled. Fine, I'll do it. Stephen smirked slightly. Good. I already have an interview lined up for you tomorrow. Emma gaped at him. You what? He leaned back, clearly pleased with himself. You're welcome, Emma groaned, resting her forehead on the table. I hate you. Stephen chuckled. No, you don't, she sighed. Unfortunately, he wasn't wrong. That evening, Emma returned to the restaurant, needing to clear her head. The space was empty now. Quiet, but it still felt alive in a way it hadn't before. She walked toward the kitchen, running her fingers along the polished wooden counters. This was where she belonged, no matter how complicated things got, no matter how much she fought against the chaos that came with Stephen Taylor. This was home. The sound of footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. You're working too much. Emma turned to find Stephen standing in the doorway, watching her with that unreadable expression. She sighed. You're one to talk. He smirked. Fair. They stood in silence for a moment, before Stephen spoke again. Are you ready for tomorrow? Emma exhaled. Not even a little. Stephen chuckled. You'll be fine, just tell the truth. She gave him a look. You don't strike me as the tell the truth type. He smirked. I prefer to control the truth. Emma shook her head, fighting a small smile. Then, after a beat of hesitation, she said, Thank you for believing in this. In me. Stephen's expression shifted slightly, just enough for her to catch it. I wouldn't have done this if I didn't. Emma swallowed, feeling that familiar, unsettling shift in the air between them. She had spent so much time seeing him as the enemy, but maybe he wasn't. Maybe he was something else entirely, and that terrified her. Emma had never been one for the spotlight. She preferred the kitchen, the heat of the stoves, the rhythmic dance of ingredients coming together to form something greater than the sum of its parts. That was where she thrived. Behind the scenes, in control, away from prying eyes. But now, thanks to Stephen Taylor, she was about to be paraded in front of the world. She stood in front of the mirror in her tiny apartment, adjusting the collar of the blouse she had borrowed from her mother. It was simple, but elegant. Clean lines, soft fabric, the kind of thing a professional woman would wear, the kind of thing she had never needed to wear before. Lucas sat on the couch, watching her with amusement. You look like you're about to throw up, Emma groaned. I feel like I'm about to throw up. Lucas smirked. Relax, it's just an interview. She shot him a look. Easy for you to say. You're not the one about to get grilled by some journalist looking for a juicy headline. He shrugged. Just tell the truth. Emma let out a humorless laugh. Funny, that's exactly what Stephen said. Lucas wrinkled his nose. Okay, now I am worried. You and Taylor are starting to think alike. Emma rolled her eyes but couldn't fight the nervous energy twisting in her stomach. She had fought so hard to get the golden table back. But now the entire city would be watching, waiting to judge whether or not she deserved it. And, whether she liked it or not, Stephen Taylor would be right there beside her when she arrived at the interview location, a sleek, modern studio in the heart of Manhattan. Emma's nerves went into overdrive. Cameras, lights, a journalist with a perfectly practiced smile. She didn't belong here. Stephen, on the other hand, looked like he was born for this. He greeted the reporter with a firm handshake, exuding effortless confidence. His suit was immaculate, his expression unreadable. Emma hated how unfazed he was. As they were seated in front of the cameras, the interviewer, a woman named Claire Dawson, smiled at them. Emma, Stephen, thank you for being here today. Stephen nodded smoothly. Our pleasure. Emma forced a polite smile, but inside, she wanted to murder him. Our pleasure. Speak for yourself. Taylor. Claire turned to Emma. Let's start with you, Emma. The Golden Table was a beloved restaurant before it closed. What does it mean to you to be bringing it back? Emma took a breath. She had rehearsed this. She knew what to say. It means everything, she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. This restaurant was my mother's dream. It was a place where people came together, where food wasn't just about eating, it was about connection. When we lost it, it felt like losing a part of her. Bringing it back isn't just about business for me. It's about honoring her legacy. Claire nodded, her eyes warm. That's beautiful. And tell me, how did this partnership with Stephen come about? Emma hesitated. This was the question she had dreaded the most. She could feel Stephen's gaze on her, waiting to see how she would spin it. She wasn't going to lie, but she also wasn't going to give him too much credit. She exhaled. Stephen's family played a role in my mother losing the restaurant. When he found out, he offered me the chance to get it back. It wasn't an easy decision, but I knew that if I wanted the Golden Table to thrive again, I needed resources I didn't have. She glanced at Stephen briefly. So, we made a deal. Claire arched a brow. And Stephen, what made you want to invest in this? Stephen didn't hesitate. Emma's head snapped toward him, surprised. Stephen's expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his voice that wasn't just businesslike. She's determined, smart, and unwilling to back down, he continued. I respect that, and I knew that if anyone could make the Golden Table a success again, it was her. Emma blinked. Was that sincerity from Stephen Taylor? Claire smiled. It sounds like you two have developed a strong partnership. Emma hesitated. Partnership? Yes. Complicated, confusing, frustrating dynamic. Absolutely. She forced a polite nod. We have our differences, but we both want this restaurant to succeed. Claire chuckled. Well, the city is certainly watching. Final question. What do you want people to know about the Golden Table as it enters this new chapter? Emma exhaled, choosing her words carefully. That it's real, she said finally. That it's not just another business venture or corporate expansion. It's a place with history, with heart, and no matter what, I will fight to make sure it stays that way. Claire smiled. I believe you. Thank you both for your time. As the interview wrapped, Emma finally allowed herself to breathe. She had survived, and, much to her annoyance, Stephen had actually made it easier. After they left the studio, Stephen walked beside her in silence for a few moments before finally speaking. You did good, Emma huffed. Don't sound so surprised. Stephen smirked. I'm not. I just wasn't sure you wouldn't throw something at me midway through. Emma rolled her eyes. I still might. They walked a few more steps before Stephen glanced at her, more serious now. Emma, that wasn't just for the cameras. What I said, I meant it. Emma swallowed, caught off guard by his directness. She wasn't sure how to respond, so instead, she did what she always did when Stephen Taylor got too close. She deflected. Come on, Taylor, she said. Let's go ruin each other's lives some more. Stephen chuckled, shaking his head. Lead the way, Evans. And as they walked toward whatever came next, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Of what? She didn't know, but it terrified her. Emma had thought the hardest part of reopening the Golden Table was behind her. She had fought for this, sacrificed for it, and now the restaurant was thriving. The buzz from the media coverage was working in their favor. Reservations were booked weeks in advance. Food critics had started to praise the revival, and for the first time in a long time, Emma felt like she wasn't just surviving, she was building something. But success, she was quickly learning, came with complications, and most of them were named Stephen Taylor. She found him in the restaurant's back office, going over reports like he had always belonged there. Emma leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. You know, for someone who supposedly isn't running this place, you sure spend a lot of time acting like you do. Stephen didn't even glance up. I'm protecting my investment. Emma rolled her eyes. Of course you are. He finally looked up, smirking. You don't seem too miserable about it. She opened her mouth to argue, but hesitated because, as much as it annoyed her to admit, he had been helpful. When a supplier tried to overcharge them, Stephen had shut it down with a single phone call. When a licensing issue nearly delayed their liquor sales, he had pulled strings she didn't even know existed. It was infuriating, because every time she wanted to hate him, he did something useful. Emma exhaled, stepping inside. Look, I get that you're invested, but I need to make sure you don't overstep. Stephen leaned back in his chair, studying her. And what exactly does overstepping look like to you? She narrowed her eyes. Making decisions without me, undermining my authority, acting like this is just another one of your business acquisitions instead of my restaurant. Stephen was quiet for a moment before finally nodding. Fair enough. Emma arched a brow. That's it. No argument, he smirked. I could argue, but I'm in a good mood today. Emma sighed. God, you're exhausting. Stephen chuckled. And yet, here you are, voluntarily talking to me. She huffed, but before she could reply, her phone buzzed. She glanced down at the screen and felt her stomach drop. Her landlord. She knew what this meant. Emma stepped out of the office, answering the call with a quiet, "Hello." "Emma, I hate to do this, but we have an issue," her landlord said. "Rent's increasing next month. Building expenses are going up and—" Emma closed her eyes, already feeling the familiar stress settle in. How much? 30%. Her stomach clenched. That was a lot. More than she could afford, especially with her mother's medical bills still looming over them. I need time to figure this out," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I can give you a few weeks, but that's the best I can do." Emma nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Okay, thanks." She ended the call, inhaling sharply. She had just gotten back on her feet. Now, the ground was shifting again. She hadn't realized Stephen had followed her until his voice cut through her thoughts. What happened? Emma turned to find him watching her. His usual smirk absent. She hesitated. The last thing she wanted was for him to know she was struggling. "It's nothing," she muttered. Stephen crossed his arms. "You're a terrible liar," Emma exhaled, debating whether or not to tell him. Finally, she admitted, "My rent is going up, a lot. I don't know if I'll be able to keep up with it." Stephen's expression didn't change, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. "How much?" Emma bristled. "Why does that matter?" "Because I can fix it," he said simply. She knew what he meant before he even said it. Emma shook her head. "No." Stephen arched a brow. "You didn't even hear my offer." "I don't need to. I'm not taking your money." His jaw tightened slightly. "Emma, no," she repeated, more firmly this time. "I let you invest in the golden table because I didn't have another choice. But my personal life, that's off limits." Stephen sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "You're ridiculously stubborn." Emma crossed her arms. "And you're ridiculously controlling." They stood in silence for a moment before Stephen spoke again, his voice softer this time. "You don't always have to do everything alone, Emma." She swallowed, looking away. "Yeah, well, I'm used to it." Stephen exhaled. "Fine, no money, but let me help in another way." Emma eyed him warily. "What does that mean?" Stephen smirked. "Just trust me," she scoffed. "See, that's the exact thing that makes me not trust you." But Stephen didn't elaborate. Instead, he simply gave her a knowing look before walking past her, disappearing back into the office. Emma exhaled, rubbing her temple. Whatever he was planning, she had a feeling it was going to annoy the hell out of her. That night, Emma arrived home feeling more drained than she had in weeks. She told herself she'd figure it out. She always figured it out. She had survived worse. She would survive this too. But when she woke up the next morning, she was met with an unexpected surprise. Her landlord had left a voicemail. "Emma, I don't know what kind of connections you have, but I just got an offer to refinance the building, which means I don't have to raise rent after all. Your lease stays the same." Emma froze. No, he wouldn't have. She grabbed her phone and without thinking dialed Stephen's number. He answered on the second ring. "Let me guess. You're calling to yell at me." Emma clenched her jaw. "What the hell did you do?" Stephen's voice was maddeningly calm. "I simply made a phone call." "Stephen," he sighed. "Fine. I may have encouraged someone I know to invest in the property, lowering your rent benefits him long term. So really, it was just a strategic—" Emma groaned. "You manipulated my landlord." Stephen chuckled. "Such an ugly word. I prefer persuaded." Emma closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. "I told you not to interfere." "You told me not to give you money," Stephen corrected. "Technically, I didn't." Emma was going to kill him. Or kiss him. No, definitely kill him. She exhaled sharply. "I don't know whether to thank you or strangle you." Stephen laughed. "That's the foundation of all great partnerships, Evans." Emma sighed, pressing her fingers to her temple. "I swear to God, if you weren't useful, I'd fire you." Stephen smirked. "You can't fire me. I own part of your restaurant, remember? Emma groaned. She was so in over her head. Emma had spent years learning how to handle difficult people, unruly customers, arrogant chefs, supervisors who thought they knew everything. She could deal with them all, but nothing could have prepared her for dealing with Stephen Taylor. The fact that he had interfered with her rent situation, without asking, made her blood boil. And what made it worse, she couldn't even deny that she was relieved. The logical part of her knew that she should be grateful. He had solved a problem she hadn't figured out how to fix. He had used his influence to make her life easier when, for years, she had only known struggle. But that didn't change the fact that he had overstepped. That morning, she stormed into his office, barely giving his assistant time to announce her presence before barging in. Stephen, of course, was completely unfazed. "Emma," he greeted smoothly, glancing up from his laptop. "You look—" "Don't!" She cut him off, slamming the door shut behind her. "Don't pretend you don't know why I'm here." Stephen leaned back in his chair, his smirk infuriatingly calm. "I assume you're here to yell at me again?" Emma crossed her arms. "You assume correctly," he sighed, rubbing his temple. "Emma, I already told you. I didn't give you anything. I just persuaded someone to invest in the building. It was a smart business move. Everyone benefits." Emma narrowed her eyes. "I didn't ask you to fix it." Stephen met her glare head on. "And if I had asked, would you have let me?" She hesitated. And that was all the answer he needed. Stephen smirked. "Exactly," Emma groaned, running a hand through her hair. "You don't get it, do you? I've spent my entire life taking care of things on my own. I don't need some rich, arrogant businessman swooping in and fixing my problems like I'm some charity case." Stephen's smirk faded. His jaw tightened, his blue eyes sharpening as he stood, stepping around the desk until he was right in front of her. "You think that's what this is?" he asked, voice low. "You think I did this because I pity you?" Emma swallowed, but refused to back down. "Didn't you?" Stephen exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Jesus, Emma. For someone so damn stubborn, you really don't see it, do you?" She frowned. "See what?" Stephen ran a hand through his hair, clearly frustrated. "You're right. You've had to do everything alone, and you can handle it, but that doesn't mean you should have to." Emma's breath caught. Stephen didn't look amused. He didn't look smug. For the first time, he looked serious, like this mattered to him. Emma hated the way her heart skipped at the thought. She swallowed, trying to push past the tension. "Stephen, I need to be able to stand on my own 2 feet. If I let you solve my problems, what happens the next time something goes wrong?" Stephen's expression softened. "Just a fraction. You're already standing on your own, Emma. But everyone needs help sometimes." Emma hated that a part of her wanted to believe him. She inhaled deeply, forcing herself to regain control. "Just promise me you won't interfere again." "Not like this. If I need help, I'll ask." Stephen held her gaze for a long moment before nodding once. "Fine, but if I see you drowning, I'm not going to stand by and watch." Emma sighed. "You're impossible." Stephen smirked. "And yet, you're still here." She rolled her eyes but couldn't argue, because as much as she hated to admit it, he was right. That evening, back at the golden table, Emma tried to focus on work, but her mind kept replaying the conversation. She didn't know what to do with this strange, growing tension between them. It wasn't just about business anymore, and that was dangerous. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Lucas approach until he plopped onto a bar stool beside her. "You look like someone just told you your life was about to get way more complicated," he observed. Emma groaned. "I hate that you know me so well." Lucas smirked. "Taylor again?" Emma didn't even bother denying it. Lucas tilted his head. "Okay, real talk. Why are you fighting this so hard?" Emma frowned. "Fighting what?" Lucas gave her a pointed look. "You know what?" Emma groaned. "Lucas?" "No, listen," he interrupted. "I get it. You don't trust him, and maybe you shouldn't. But have you considered just once that maybe he's not the guy you thought he was?" Emma hesitated, because she had considered it, and that was the problem. She exhaled. I don't know if I can trust him." Lucas shrugged. "Then don't. But maybe give him the chance to prove you wrong." Emma hated that he made sense. She rested her head against the bar. I hate everything about this. Lucas laughed. Yeah, that's usually how it starts. Emma sighed, staring at the ceiling. She was so screwed. Emma had always believed that control was the only thing keeping her life together. For years, she had learned how to depend on no one but herself. Life had taught her that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, that the only person who would truly fight for her was her. But then came Stephen Taylor, and he was ruining everything. The tension between them had been simmering beneath the surface for weeks now. Emma had tried to ignore it, to pretend that their partnership was purely business. But every time she turned around, Stephen was there, challenging her, helping her, frustrating her, making her question everything. And now, as she stood in the dimly lit kitchen of the Golden Table, staring at him across the stainless steel counters, she knew that whatever had been building between them was about to boil over. Stephen leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her with that maddeningly calm expression. "You've been avoiding me," he said. Emma let out a sharp laugh. "I run a restaurant, Stephen. I don't have time to babysit your ego." Stephen smirked. "Cute, but we both know that's not what this is about." Emma crossed her arms. "Oh, really? Enlighten me." He stepped closer, his blue eyes sharper now. "You're scared," Emma scoffed. "Of what?" Stephen didn't hesitate. "Of me." Her stomach twisted, but she forced herself to keep her expression neutral. "Don't flatter yourself, Taylor." He tilted his head. "Then prove me wrong." The air between them felt impossibly thick. Emma hated how easily he could see through her. She hated that, despite everything, a part of her did trust him, that a part of her wanted to believe he was different from the man she had thought he was. But she couldn't afford to make that mistake. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "I don't have time for this," Stephen sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Emma, I don't—" Before he could finish, the kitchen doors swung open, and Sarah, one of their waitresses, rushed in, looking flustered. "Emma, there's someone asking for you at the front. Said it's important." Emma frowned. "Who?" Sarah hesitated. "He wouldn't give his name. But—" He looked serious. Emma exchanged a quick glance with Stephen before muttering, "Great, that's exactly what I need right now." With one last look at Stephen, one she couldn't quite decipher, she pushed past him and headed for the front of the restaurant. The man waiting for her was in his late 40s. Dressed in a suit that screamed lawyer, Emma's stomach tightened. He stood when she approached, offering a professional smile. "Miss Evans?" She folded her arms. "That depends. Who's asking?" The man reached into his briefcase and pulled out an envelope. "I'm here on behalf of Gerald Whitmore's estate." Emma froze. Whitmore. The name sent a chill through her spine. Her mother had mentioned that name before, years ago. He had been one of the investors who had originally shown interest in the Golden Table, back when her mother still owned it. "What does his estate want with me?" she asked carefully. The lawyer handed her the envelope. "Mr. Whitmore recently passed, and in his final will, he left behind documents concerning the previous ownership of this establishment." Emma's pulse pounded. "What kind of documents?" The lawyer's smile was tight. "The kind you might want to read carefully." Emma swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the envelope. "And what exactly am I supposed to do with this?" The lawyer inclined his head. "That's up to you, Miss Evans. But if I were you, I'd pay close attention to the details." With that, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Emma standing in the middle of her restaurant, staring at the envelope in her hands. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The only thing she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then, a familiar voice broke through the chaos in her head. "Emma!" She turned to see Stephen standing a few feet away, watching her with an expression that was dangerously close to concern. "What's going on?" he asked. Emma exhaled shakily. "I don't know yet." Stephen stepped closer, his gaze dropping to the envelope in her hands. "Do you want me to—" "No," she said quickly. She wasn't ready to let him in on this. Not yet. Not until she knew what she was dealing with. Stephen studied her for a moment before nodding slowly. "Okay." Emma swallowed, gripping the envelope tighter. "I have to go." Stephen didn't try to stop her. He just watched as she turned and walked out the door. When Emma got home, she sat on the couch, staring at the envelope like it might explode. Her hands trembled as she finally tore it open. Inside were pages of old contracts, letters, and her breath caught. At the very bottom of the pile was a document, one that bore her mother's signature, one that stated, in clear legal terms, that the golden table had never been meant to be sold permanently. Her mother had never given up full ownership, which meant that technically, neither had Emma. Her heart pounded. If this was real, if this contract was still valid, then the golden table didn't belong to Stephen Taylor. It had always belonged to her. Emma sat frozen on the couch, her hands gripping the document so tightly that the edges crumpled beneath her fingers. This changed everything. Her mother had never truly given up the golden table. The contract, buried beneath years of legal paperwork and acquisitions, clearly stated that the sale to Stephen's father had been temporary. The restaurant was never meant to be absorbed into the Taylor empire permanently, which meant Stephen had no claim to it. A rush of emotions surged through her. Anger, betrayal, disbelief. Had Stephen known? Had he always known? No. She shook her head. If he had, he never would have needed to offer her the partnership in the first place. But still, the thought nagged at her. How much did he really know? Emma stood abruptly, shoving the documents into her bag. There was only one way to get answers. She needed to confront him. The elevator ride up to Stephen's office felt like an eternity. By the time she reached the top floor, her blood was boiling. She stormed past his assistant, ignoring her startled protests, and pushed open the glass doors to his office. Stephen looked up from his desk, eyebrows lifting at her sudden entrance. Emma, she slammed the papers onto his desk. Explain this. He frowned, glancing down at the documents. As his eyes scanned the pages, his expression changed, from curiosity to confusion, then something deeper, something that looked an awful lot like realization. Where did you get this? He asked, his voice dangerously calm. Emma crossed her arms. That's your first question, Stephen exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Emma, She cut him off. Did you know? He met her gaze, and for the first time since she'd met him, he hesitated. I didn't, he admitted. Not until now. Emma's breath hitched. You swear? Stephen nodded, his jaw tight. I would never have... He exhaled sharply, looking away for a moment before meeting her eyes again. I would never have let my father take something that wasn't legally his. And I sure as hell wouldn't have let you think you owed me anything. Emma's pulse pounded. She wanted to believe him, but trust wasn't something she gave easily. And what now? She asked, her voice quieter. Stephen studied her carefully, then looked down at the contract again. Slowly, he reached for his pen. Without hesitation, he scribbled his signature across a sheet of paper, then slid it toward her. Emma frowned, glancing down. It was a legal forfeiture of any ownership claims to the golden table. Stephen was signing it away. To her breath caught. You're just giving it back, Stephen exhaled. It was never mine to begin with. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Emma's fingers trembled as she picked up the paper, staring at his signature. That was it. It was hers. Completely. No strings, no contracts, no Stephen Taylor looming over her shoulder. Then why did it feel like something inside her was breaking? Emma should have been ecstatic. She won. She had the golden table back, legally and completely. No more partnerships, no more deals. So why did it feel like something was missing? The answer haunted her for days. The restaurant ran as smoothly as ever, but Stephen was gone. He didn't stop by the way he used to. Didn't call, didn't text. For the first time since this whole mess began, he had stepped back entirely, and Emma hated how much she noticed. Hated that she caught herself glancing at the door, expecting to see him smirking at her. Hated that when something went wrong, her first instinct was to call him. She had spent so much time fighting him, and now that he was gone, it felt wrong. Lucas noticed before she did. Okay, this has to stop, he said one evening as they closed up the restaurant. Emma looked up. What? Lucas crossed his arms. You've been miserable all week, Emma scoffed. I'm not miserable. Lucas arched a brow. Emma, you got everything you wanted. You should be celebrating, but instead you're mopey and brooding. She rolled her eyes. I don't brood. Lucas smirked. Uh-huh, sure. He tilted his head. You miss him? Emma's stomach twisted. She stopped, because denying it would be a lie. She exhaled sharply, pressing her fingers to her temple. It doesn't matter. Stephen Taylor and I don't work. We never worked. Lucas gave her a knowing look. Then why are you still thinking about him? Emma had no answer, because the truth was, she didn't want this to be the end. She had spent so much time pushing Stephen away. But maybe she had been pushing away something good, something she wasn't ready to lose. Emma found Stephen at his office. It felt like déjà vu, barging in without warning, but she wasn't in the mood for formalities. Stephen looked up, surprised. Emma, she exhaled. You've been avoiding me. He leaned back in his chair. You got what you wanted, Evans. Her heart clenched. Did I? Stephen studied her, his expression unreadable. What are you saying? Emma swallowed. I should be happy. The golden table is mine. I don't have to fight anymore. Stephen's jaw tightened. Then why do you look like you lost something? She took a shaky breath. Because maybe I did. The room fell silent. Emma hesitated, then forced herself to say the words she had been afraid of. I miss you, Stephen. His eyes darkened. Emma, I know you drive me insane, she interrupted. And I know I spent weeks trying to push you away, but I don't want to push you away anymore. Stephen exhaled slowly. Standing from his desk, when he reached her, he tilted his head, searching her face. You're sure? Emma's chest tightened. For once in my life. Yes. Stephen's smirk returned, softer this time. He took another step closer, and then, without hesitation, he kissed her. Emma melted into him instantly. Because this was right. The battle was over. But what came next? That was a fight she was finally willing to lose. Months later, the golden table was more successful than ever. Emma still ran things her way. Stephen still annoyed the hell out of her. But now, when he smirked at her from across the restaurant, she didn't roll her eyes. She smiled, because sometimes the things we fight the hardest are the ones we need the most.